To begin weaving our basket, we need to start by creating tubes of paper to weave together. It doesn't matter what you roll your paper around as long as you use the same item for all of the tubes that you're creating. A good width is a drinking straw or a pencil. Just make sure whatever you start with is what you use for all of the tubes so that they're all the same diameter. If they're different lengths, that's okay, as long as the thickness of the tubes remains the same. To roll tubes, I like to start with about a 4-inch strip, and I take my pencil and line it up against the bottom right corner of the strip. And the triangle that you want is a nice long slice, and I usually refer to it like a slice of pizza, with a little bit of crust and a lot of cheese. You don't want something that is the same measurement on all sides, so a nice long skinny cut of pizza. You're going to start by lifting that bottom corner and wrapping it up around the pencil or whatever you're rolling around. You want to just kind of tuck that corner under, hold tight, and begin to roll. If as you're rolling, you're noticing that your pencil is shorter than the pieces where it looks like it might accidentally get stuck inside, you can slide that out a little bit, and you're going to slide all the way to the end. When you get to the end, you're going to take a little bit of glue. I find a glue stick works best for this. Put a little bit of glue on the last corner. Continue to roll. And then you just want to hold it for a couple of seconds so that that glue has a chance to really hold. And when you let go, it doesn't unravel. The last step is to remove the item that you're rolling around. So you can just come down to the end of the tube. If it's not coming out, you can give it a little bit of a counterclockwise spin, give it a little bit of a wiggle, and it should slide right out. If it does end up getting stuck inside the other side, you can send another item of equal size on a rescue mission, push it inside the tube to push the item out the other side. Once you've rolled your first tube, you're going to continue rolling until you have about 50 tubes to make a normal sort of medium-sized basket. I like to over roll and create a few extras. Sometimes some of the ones you make aren't really the same size, or as you're weaving, you notice that they're not quite working. And it's nice to be able to kind of toss a couple of the irregular ones as you go. And also to be able to weave without running out of strips and having to stop and roll. But if you do need more, you can always just roll some more tubes as you are working on your basket. The next item that you are going to need is some kind of container. This is going to help us hold the sides of our basket straight as we are weaving. You can use any kind of container. The shape of the container that you're using and the size is going to be roughly the size of your basket. So you can use, a yogurt container, a plastic Tupperware container, something that you have in the house that's roughly around this size. You don't want to be weaving around something that's really tiny and end up with a tiny basket, and nothing that's too big. Unless you want to make a giant basket, but some kind of medium-sized container to start with. The next step is going to be to create the base for our basket. So for that, I'm going to be using chipboard. Chipboard is a type of cardboard that has one single layer. It's the kind of cardboard that they use to make food packaging, cereal boxes, pasta boxes, things like tissues, any of those thin cardboards. You don't want the thick cardboard that has that wavy layer in between like you get in shipping boxes, but this nice thin cardboard. It doesn't matter what the picture is on the box because we're going to be using and seeing the inside of the box. If you do happen to have a package that has a cool graphic and you want that to be part of your basket, you can choose to use the side that has the image on it. I'm going to be using this brown side for my piece. So I'm going to start off by taking the container that I've chosen as my template, and I'm going to place that on top of the cardboard and just simply trace around the outside with a pencil so that I get a circle template that is the same size as my container. And once I've got that traced, I'm going to take a pair of scissors and go ahead and cut that out. Now I'm going to need 2 of these circles. So I put my circle over in the corner to allow me more room to use the rest of the cardboard to cut out my shapes. So very carefully cutting on my pencil line here. And once I've got that cut out, I'm going to take that piece, put it down on top of the cardboard, and give that one more trace around because I need 2 that are exactly the same size. I'll go ahead and cut that out too. Just make sure that you're not cutting over any of the part of the cardboard that's irregular. You want nice, smooth, flat pieces. All right, and I've got my 2 circles, and I just kind of want to match those up. If they're a little bit off, my container has some little nubs on the bottom, which makes it a little hard to trace. I can just kind of line those up, trim around the outsides to make those even. And if they're off by a tiny little bit, it's okay because you won't be able to tell once we get our weaving going. So flip this over. It looks good from both sides. Again, if you had something that had a cool graphic, or I wanted a pizza basket, I could leave the cheese showing. But for this example, I'm going to use the brown side so that the graphic doesn't show. Our next step is to create the warp of the basket, and those are the uprights that we're going to be weaving around. It is extremely important when you are laying down the warp of your basket that you start with an odd number of spokes. So the amount of spokes that you put warp pieces around your base is up to you. The more you put on, the tighter a weave you will have, and the less you put on, the looser the weave will be. So it tends to look better if you create, you know, a little bit of space in between. You don't want to just put a couple pieces on and leave really big gaps between the warp pieces, because this is too much of a space for the weft, which is the piece that we're going to be weaving through it, to span. So you want to kind of take a look at, and it's going to depend on the size of the base that you're working with, but you want to take a look at your pieces and kind of figure out about how many spokes you think that you want to put onto this base. So looking at this, I'm probably going to go somewhere around here. And you're going to need a little bit of a big space. You might see I'm struggling to keep this within the camera range here. But you want to lay these out so that there's not a lot of room between your spokes. And again, the more that you put in there, you can put more or less, will give you a tighter or a looser basket once they go into the upright. So once you've got it kind of eyeballed and figured out, you're gonna go ahead and make sure that you're marking which one is your start and give them a count. You want an odd number. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. So I have an even number. So I either need to remove one or add one so that I have an odd number. If you don't begin with an odd number of warps, you're going to have a very difficult time with weaving. So once you have kind of figured out and spaced out your warp pieces, you're going to start with just one of the 2 cardboard pieces, and you want to kind of lay these out so that they are evenly spaced around the base. And depending on the space that you have that you're working with on your table, you may have to move yourself around to be able to get these kind of spaced out so that they aren't running into anything. And you don't have to get super crazy about measuring and making sure that everything is super straight. It being an odd number of pieces is going to be really hard because you're not going to be able to kind of start off with those even parallel pieces. Just kind of eyeballing it, sort of trying to get them all evenly spaced along the circle, so there's an even amount of space between them. And when you think you've got them about even, then you're going to start with your glue. If you have a hot glue gun, this would be a great time to grab that. If you don't, using some kind of Elmer's glue will work. Glue sticks don't tend to be strong enough to hold this part, so I would recommend either a hot glue gun or the white school glue will hold. We're going to leave these to dry for a little bit. So if you're using regular glue, you'll just have to let them dry a little bit longer. So you're going to go ahead and put a little bit of glue on each piece and lay that down and continue all the way around. And once you have them all glued, you want to just give the glue a couple of minutes to dry, so you can just step aside, do something else, and come back once the glue's had a chance to set. Once the glue has had a chance to dry, you want to flatten down the part of the tube that extends to the inside of the cardboard. You don't really need to flatten out the rest of it. So just give that a little bit of a squish to make that flatten a little bit easier for the next step. The next step is going to be to add a little bit more glue. And this glue you want to put in the base of the basket. As well as on top and in between each one of your warp spokes. That one didn't get a chance to dry all the way. But make sure you're getting glue on each one and in between. Then you're going to take your last circle, place that right on top, and you want to give that a push down. Be careful your table surface underneath. Some of the glue might come out. It's washable glue. If you have hot glue, you can just hot glue it. Hold it for a couple of seconds. Watch that the extra glue doesn't burn your fingers. If you're using white glue like this, you have a couple options. You can put something heavy in the center to hold it down until it gets a chance to dry. So the container that I'm using is not very heavy on its own, but if I put that container down, it fits perfectly right on top, and then I can pile some heavy books or some other kind of heavy weight on top to get that to hold down and give that a little while for that glue to really dry. So I'm gonna go ahead, weight this down, let it dry for a little bit, and then I will come back and show you how to weave. Once the glue's had a chance to dry, you can remove the items that you had sitting on it for weight and clean up any extra glue that kind of seeped around the edges. And you can just kind of pull it off, kind of smooth that out. Just putting it on a paper towel, kind of wipe up the surface so that I can begin my weaving. Once the glue has dried and the base is secure, you're ready to start weaving. Some people like to leave the tubes more rounded. Some people like to press them flat. It's up to you which one you want to do. Just whatever way you're going to choose, you want to make sure that you do that before you begin weaving. So I'm just going to use the handle of my scissors and press these tubes flat all the way out just to make it a little bit easier when I begin weaving, so that they are all pre-flattened. And you can use your hand for this too, but the ink, if you're using newspaper, will rub off. So I like to use the side of a scissor or something slides a little bit better. And if they don't stay perfectly flat, that's totally fine. But you want to start off by flattening them if you're going to do that. The next step is going to be to begin creating the weft, which is the piece that you're going to be weaving with. So these tubes that we've been creating are now going to become the long piece that we're going to weave through our warp pieces. I'm going to begin by gluing a few of these together for my first piece to start. Some people like to pre-glue them before they begin weaving so that they don't have to start and stop as many times. Some people like to add them as they go. Once you get working, you'll be able to decide which method works best for you. So when you rolled your tubes, what you might have noticed is that one end is slightly bigger than the other. And that is actually a good thing because that is how we are going to put them inside of each other to extend the tube. So this one has the smaller end on this side. This one is larger. The smaller end fits right inside the larger and creates one really long tube. You don't want to take the tube and push it inside of the other one as far as it goes, because we want as much length as possible for all of these tubes we rolled. So we're just going to use these pieces, put a little bit of glue stick on the end, and you can use whatever kind of glue you have. I like to use glue stick for this part because it's a little bit easier to manage. And I'm just going to slide that inside my other piece about an inch or two. You don't, again, want to slide it all the way down because we want as much length as possible. The more length we have, the less tubes that we're going to need and the less chance that we'll have to roll more later. So you're just going to give that a little bit of a squeeze, and you can flatten these ones as well. I usually flatten them after I slide one inside the other. It just makes life a little bit easier. So I'm just going to take that end, put a little bit of glue on that side as well. Slide that in to extend my end. Give it a little squeeze. And I'm going to continue gluing my pieces one inside the other to create a nice long piece. I'm going to start with about the length of 4 tubes to create my first piece. And I can always add more as I go, depending on how long of a piece I like to work with. To begin weaving, I'm going to start by attaching the end of the weft, which is that really long piece that I created, to one of the spokes of the warp. So these uprights, which will be sticking upright in a few minutes, are called your warp pieces. So I'm going to start by taking this piece and I'm going to put a little bend in the end, and I'm going to use that to kind of hook it onto my first piece here. So I'm going to go ahead and put a little bit of glue on this first piece, wrap it around my first piece to start, and I'm going to give that a little hold for a minute, or you can use a paper clip to get that started so that that piece is nice and firmly attached. So you can give it a couple minutes to dry, or you can begin weaving with the paper clip on. We can take that off later. So now becomes the time where I'm going to start to put my warp pieces upright. Now it's easier to weave when you are holding your pieces upright and working. You'll see me from time to time tilt them to the side just so you get a better view on the camera. But again, if you can keep yours with the base flat on the table, it tends to work a little bit better. So I'm going to once again return to my guide container. This was the container that I used to create that form on the bottom. And I'm going to use this to help ensure that my warp pieces stay upright as I begin to weave. So when we weave, you always want to make sure that you're alternating which pieces of the warp you're going around. So in front, in back, in front, in back. And you want to make sure that you're alternating each warp as you go. And because we have an odd number of warps, by the time we make it back to the beginning, you'll see that you're already set up to do the opposite for the second row. So I'm going to begin with my first piece, and we're going to call this one on the inside. And I'm going to make sure that I go to the outside of my next warp. I'm going to take this one to the inside. So I'll allow that warp to go up. My next one will go outside. So I'm going to take this next one, tip it up, and my weft will go around the outside. So inside, outside as you go. And you don't have to worry about lifting these outside ones. They can lay down for right now. The second row is going to hold those up. So I'm just going to continue bringing my weft around here. So I went to the outside of this one, inside, outside. And you don't have to worry about this being super neat on your first pass around. Just getting the correct inside, outside will do. So that when you make it back to where you started, so I've made it back to my paper clip here, I'm just going to take a moment and push this piece nice and firm against my guide form here, and then begin my second row. So for my second row, my first piece I started on the inside. So I want to make sure that now on my second pass around that I'm pulling on that nice and tight, and I'm going to start doing the opposite. So it was inside before, so it's going to go outside now. This one was outside before, so it's going to go inside. So this is going to bring that next row of warps upright as you begin to weave. So make sure whatever that you did the first row around, you're going to do the exact opposite now that you are headed back on row 2. And it's going to look a little bit kind of crazy to start. Once you get your first couple of rows on, it'll really give you a chance to kind of straighten everything out. And that guide container is really going to help you as you get going to make sure that your pieces stay nice and straight. So I'll tip this to the side so that you can see over, under, and that first one should always be opposite of whatever your second row is doing, just to double check yourself. I'm going to continue weaving around, picking up all of those warp pieces that I left hanging out and flat before. Until I get back to where I started. And then once again, I just want to make sure that I'm going to kind of pull this row tight here, slide it down. So you want the first row to be right up against the second row. Oops, my guide fell out when I tipped it. So just set that back down flat in there. And you want to make sure that before you begin your next row, just like when we wove on our yarn tapestries, whoops, my glue let go. And that might happen. You can just go back, add a little glue, just look at your last pattern, see where you left off to figure out where you need to continue. Now, sometimes I'm having a hard time getting this end inside here because it's a little bit flimsy. I can trim the end of this a little bit, which makes the end a little bit more sturdy and a little easier to hook back into the last one. And then I'm just gonna let that dry for a minute so I don't end up pulling it out when I pull. Now I've started to come to the end of my weft on my third row around, so I'm going to once again take another couple tubes and add those into my weft. And while I wait for those to dry a little bit, I can come back to the couple rows that I did finish and start to kind of straighten things out. So before you get too high, you want to sort of make sure everything is headed in a nice even direction. So as you get a few rows on, this will become easier to fix. You want to make sure that each one of your warps is going straight up and down. You don't want them hanging out slightly, turned to the side. So once you get a few rows in, you'll be able to kind of tighten those rows up and adjust your warps to make sure that they are nice and upright. In the beginning, this is a little difficult before you have a couple rows on there. So if they're not really staying straight up and down, you might need to add one more row before you try and really straighten them out. Once you get a few rows on, it kind of helps hold the whole thing together a little bit better. And you can kind of get the spacing right. Again, you want to do it before you get too high, but if you don't have enough rows, it won't really hold straight for you. So weaving nice and tight to that guide container is going to allow your pieces to kind of follow that shape. So you should be weaving nice and snug to that guide form so that your container stays nice and even. Without the guide container on the inside, it becomes very easy to kind of over pull or not pull hard enough to create the shape that you are working on. So here you can start to see I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rows on here, and I'm really starting to be able to kind of space out my warps and make sure that they're sitting nice and straight. I also want to make sure that if I have any slack, I kind of work that out before I get any higher, because once you get a little too far away from it, it becomes a little bit too difficult to go back and try and fix any of those loose spots. So I had a little extra slack here, so I'm just going to kind of work my way around. Now that everything's kind of holding together, just kind of pushing with my thumb to get that extra length of the weft to kind of scooch forward. And this gets easier once you really get going on it. It's kind of a little difficult to start, but once you get going, you'll notice it gets a lot easier. Stick with it. It's gonna get there. And I like to spend a little extra time on making sure that I have a nice sturdy base, because if you have a nice base to work from, it makes it much easier for the rest of the basket. So I'm going to take this opportunity also to remove this paper clip while I'm here now, because that glue has had a chance to dry. So I don't really need that anymore. And I'm just going to continue to add pieces to the weft and continue weaving around until I reach the top of my guide container or the height of the basket where I want it to end. So I just noticed that I had an error in my last row. So before I go any further, I want to make sure that I go back and fix that. So sometimes you don't catch one of your mix-ups right away, but usually you'll catch it on the next row up because things start to not look quite right. So here I've got under, over, under. There we go. So now I'm back to that spot and I'm back on track. And once you've made it to the top of the container, you just want to make sure that you go back and kind of push down each one of those rows nice and tight. There shouldn't be any negative space visible between the rows of weft. So I'm just going to kind of take a moment, slide these down, make sure, give them a little tug on my warps to make sure that those are nice and tight and upright. You can probably get another row in here. I'm going to add one final piece to the top to finish out that last row. Get this little corner of glue. Now it is possible to weave up past your guide container. You just have to be really careful as you're doing that, that you want to make sure that you're maintaining that same shape as you are going. So I'm going to continue around on the top here until I make it back to where I'm kind of leveled off here and get ready to end my weaving. So I want to end where the piece is kind of level with the top so that I can do this as seamlessly as possible. So when I make it to the end, I'm going to end very similar to how I started in the beginning. So I'm going to take this piece and I'm going to glue it on the inside of the basket. So at this point, I can release that form, and that container should just slide out of the inside. And I have my basket shape here. I'm going to take this last row. I'm going to put a little bit of glue, and I'm going to end this on the inside here so that it doesn't really show. I'm going to put a little bit of glue on that last tab, and then I'm just going to glue it to the inside here. And you can clip it or hold it and give it a couple of minutes to dry before we finish off the top of our basket. Once our last row of weft is secure and dry, we are ready to end our warp pieces. If your warps are really short, you can use some of those extra tubes, just like we extended the weft, to glue and extend to create a little bit of extra length to work with. As long as they're at least 2 inches, they should be enough to work with. So we're going to continue around, starting on whichever one you want on the top, working our way around creating a nice even top for the basket. So we're going to take each one of these warp pieces, and before I glue it, I'm just going to give it a little tug to make sure it's nice and tight all the way up. Now this one ends on the inside of the basket, so I am going to end this one by taking it and wrapping it to the outside. I'm going to put a little bit of glue on that top weft right underneath so that when this folds over, it attaches there. And I'm going to take this warp, bend it, and I'm going to tuck it underneath this weft here. And sometimes this just takes a little bit of wiggling. I'm going to spin this around so I can see it a little better. There we go. And give it a little pinch here. If you have some kind of clip like a clothespin or more paper clips or a hair clip or anything, or you just want to hold it for a couple of seconds if you don't have any clips to let that glue dry, and then you're going to continue to the next one. So this one ends on the outside, so I'm going to take this one and do the same thing, but I'm going to fold it to the inside. So again, I'm going to put a little bit of glue where that's going to tip over. I'm going to bring it to the inside and kind of tuck and weave that piece down in there. Now you're going to have some extra ends that are going to be sticking out, and I'm going to trim those after my glue dries. So I'm going to give that glue a chance to really hold before I go and start trimming around the outside. But you're going to continue this all the way around the basket, alternating. Any ones that end on the inside go up and over, which is going to secure that last row of weft. And tuck. And it just takes a little bit of patience to kind of tuck them in there and get them to pop through. And then once you get them, just kind of even out your piece and either clip or hold. Sometimes they're tucked in tight enough that they'll hold themselves. Once the glue has had a chance to dry, you can remove all of the clips and trim very carefully your extra work pieces. And then do the same thing on the inside. This is a little trickier to trim, but not as visible. So it's a little more forgiving. And there you have it, your newspaper basket. Now, if you have any little pieces that happen to kind of stick out from where the rolls ended, you can just put a little extra glue on those. Hold those down. And there you have it.